All right, I think we'll get started this evening. It's just a few minutes past 6 o'clock, so I wanted to just welcome you this evening. Good evening. My name is Michael DeLulo. I'm the administrator for Middlesex Center, and I would like to welcome you this evening to this evening's public meeting for the official plan review. Before we begin, I would like to advise that we are recording this evening's information session so that it can be placed on our website and viewed afterwards. As we have a large number of registrants, we will be using the video technology to gather feedback through polling. However, if there are any specific comments that we cannot get to, please go to our official plan webpage where you can email direct so that all feedback and commentary can be taken into consideration as we finalize the plans later this year. The contact information will be displayed at the end of the slide presentation. Tonight, we are not talking about a particular plan application. Instead, we're going to focus on the macro picture of what we can do together to grow our municipality for the future. Thank you for taking the time this evening to attend and listen. I'm going to pass it on to Matt Alexander and Natasha McDonald from WSP Group, who are undertaking the comprehensive review for the municipality. So I'll hand it over to Matt and Natasha, and we'll walk our way through the findings to date.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. So thanks again, everyone, for joining tonight for the public open house for the Municipality of Middlesex Center's official plan review. There we go. We appreciate you all taking the time this evening to join us, and I understand there's a lot of participants tonight, which is very exciting. So to get things started, I wanted to provide a brief introduction of the project team. So with us tonight, we have staff from Middlesex Center, so Michael DeLulo, who you just heard from. We also have Heather Caprin on the line. From Middlesex County, we have Marian Cabral. And from WSP, we have Matt Alexander and myself, Natasha MacDonald. So for tonight's agenda, I'll provide a brief overview of the official plan review process, as well as why we're undertaking this work. I'll then go through some project and public engagement updates, and then I'll hand it off to Matt, who will provide a presentation on the draft directions and recommendations report, which we'll open up to a Q&A session, and we'll wrap up tonight's meeting by going over next steps as part of the project. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. So during the presentation, we kindly request that people keep their microphone on mute. If they do have any questions that they would like to ask the team, we ask that you kindly use the raise hand function when we get to the Q&A session if you'd like to ask your question vocally. Otherwise, you can put any comments or questions that you have that you think of during the presentation using the chat function. So we're going to be going through the questions that way when we get to the Q&A session. And again, just to keep in mind, we are broadcasting this meeting via YouTube. So if you do want to ask a question vocally or on camera, we just want to make sure that you're mindful that your name or your video might come up and it's publicly accessible. So if you want to avoid that, we just recommend that you use the chat function. So the objectives for tonight's meeting is to provide an update on the project's progress so far, to present the draft directions and recommendations report, to obtain feedback regarding the policy recommendations for the updated official plan, and to inform you all about next steps and how to stay involved in the project. So as Michael mentioned, we are going to be doing some quick polls throughout the duration of the presentation just to get collect some feedback from you all so that we can get some specific details. And we have a few questions as sort of an icebreaker quick poll. So Heather, I'll ask that you launch the poll, please. So the first question, how long have you lived in Middlesex Center? So we'll give you about 30 seconds to submit your response. Thank you. All right, so we see, so a lot of you have lived here for over 20 years, so you obviously have tons of local knowledge, which is excellent for tonight's discussion. So we'll move on to the second question for this first quick poll. So the second question we have, where do you live? Are you currently residing in a rural area, a hamlet, or one of the community settlement areas within the municipality? Or do you actually live outside of Middlesex Center? And I'm just curious about the OPR. Thank you, Heather. All right, so we have a decent distribution. We have 30%, nearly 30% are residing in a hamlet. And then we've got, let's see, some quick math here, about 40% or so within a community settlement area, 16% outside of Middlesex Center, so that's really interesting, and then a handful in rural as well. So this is great feedback. Thanks, everyone. And now the third question for this first round. So is there a particular issue that inspired you to come to this meeting tonight? We'll just give about 30 seconds or so to submit. All right, so in terms of interests amongst the group, we have half our interest in growth management, so that's very helpful and definitely something to take into consideration when we go through the Q&A. So thanks again, everyone, for your participation in the first poll. And as I mentioned, we'll have a few kind of pop up during the presentation. So thanks again. All right, so what's the purpose of the official plan? Why are we here tonight, and why are we undertaking this work? Well, the official plan provides guidance on the long-term management of growth and change within the municipality. So this document includes the goals, objectives, and policies relating to land use, agricultural areas, settlement areas, and natural areas, as well as economic, social, and servicing matters within the municipality. And in terms of why we're undertaking this work, there's a few reasons for that. The first being that under the Planning Act, municipalities are required to update their official plan every 5 years. And this is to ensure that we stay consistent with provincial policies. We want to make sure that our municipal official plan is in line with key land use directions and policies from both the provincial level as well as the county level. But it's also an important exercise to make sure that the municipality's official plan actually reflects the current needs of the municipality and its communities, as well as think how we want to manage our growth and serve our communities into the future. So that's why we're undertaking this important project. Now, in terms of the project's work plan, we're currently in phase 3 of the official plan review process, where we're starting to prepare the policy directions for the updated official plan. So at the beginning of phase 3, the team prepared a directions and recommendations report, which Matt is going to be presenting to you later tonight. And we presented, which is essentially the policy recommendations for the updated official plan. So we presented these last week to some key stakeholder groups and obtained feedback from them, and now we're presenting them to you all this evening as well, which we hope to get some valuable feedback, which will help us finalize the recommendations report, and then will move us into phase 4 of the project where we actually draft the updated official plan. So again, the feedback that we received last week and tonight is really important to make sure that the updated official plan reflects the interests and needs of everyone residing within the communities. And so part of this work has included considerable engagement and consultation efforts. During phase 1 and 2 of the project, we held a special meeting of council. We held a vision survey, which received over 500 responses, as well as a vision workshop was held last fall. And so this was to establish the guiding vision, which will help guide the updated official plan and its policies. We also consulted with a stakeholder advisory committee and a technical advisory committee during phase 2 to discuss 5 discussion papers that were presented and prepared during phase 2 of the project, which I will touch on in a few minutes, essentially collecting key issues and key items to consider as part of updating the official plan. And then now in phase 3, as I mentioned, we consulted with stakeholder groups last week, and we're consulting with the public this evening to review policy recommendations. But there's also ongoing public engagement efforts. So this includes, regular updates to the official plan website, which is available on the municipalities website. This also includes always accepting comments and questions from the public to the municipality. And again, we'll provide that email at the end of the meeting. And also releasing media posts during key milestones and informing the community about upcoming engagement opportunities. And so some of the key themes that we've heard so far from the engagement that we've completed so far includes, residents really value its agricultural roots and rural charm. There's also support for complete communities. So that essentially means creating communities where it's convenient to access and convenient to go from where you live, where you work, where you want to spend your free time, and having convenient access to key community amenities and facilities. There's also support for a range of housing typologies, and there's support to encourage the diversification of the local economy, as well as enhance active transportation options within the municipality. And some of the other feedback that we've heard just last week amongst the stakeholders was, looking into developing secondary plans to manage growth in more specific areas and what that looks like within different areas of the municipality. And this includes planning for, services such as schools. And finally, we've heard that the updated official plan should really provide clear policies regarding communal servicing. And finally, I wanted to touch on the 5 discussion papers that were developed as part of phase 2 of this project. So the project team looked at 5 key topics of the official plan, such as growth management, infrastructure, economic diversification, natural heritage and hazards, as well as general policy, which looked at a number of issues, including agriculture, which is, of course, really important to the municipality, and other notions such as complete communities. So these 5 discussion papers were really important to help inform the policy recommendations that Matt's going to go over very shortly. And these documents are also available on the project website if you want to review them if you haven't had an opportunity to do so already. And so with that, I will hand it over to Matt to go over the draft directions and recommendations report.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight and taking the time to participate in this incredibly important project. I'm going to speak a little bit about the directions and recommendations report, and later on, Michael and I will sort of be responding to your questions. I'm the project manager on this. I'm from WSP, and to be honest, I'm not a member of your community. I don't live within Middlesex Center, but over the last 6 months or so, or 6 to 8 months that I've been on the project, I've gotten to know a lot of the major issues and subject matter topics that are of interest to people who have been involved in development in the community, but also new residents, business owners. I've been hearing from a lot of people from all sectors and all interest groups within the municipality, and working closely with municipal staff to prepare this directions and recommendations report. And as Natasha mentioned, this is really taking a lot of the background information that was collected as part of the discussion papers, identifying areas where there might be opportunity to improve policies or fill in the gaps where maybe there hasn't been policy to direct certain types of development or certain types of land uses. And with this report, we're recommending specific changes to the official plan to guide growth in the next number of years, up to 25 years. So just to speak to this slide specifically, we It does include, the report includes some justification for the changes to policy, as well as land use designations and mapping, and it provides a basis for the actual changes that will be recommended in the draft official plan amendments in the future. Let's go to the next slide. We focused on the same key issues as the discussion papers. We looked at growth management and approaches to intensification, as well as approaches to settlement area expansion, essentially when to consider that. We looked at infrastructure, including servicing hierarchy and servicing capacity that exists within the municipality. We looked at natural heritage and hazards, economic diversification, and a whole slew of things related to, or not related to, but a whole slew of general policy areas, which include complete communities, on-farm diversified uses, and rural lot creation. And I'll get into more detail on that in the next slides. So on the topic of growth management, which I understand just from the poll earlier, just a couple minutes ago, is significant concern or interest in the municipality. What we're looking to do is we're recommending that growth be directed to the existing settlement areas. And the reason for that is that these settlement areas provide the most existing amenities and facilities, so parks, open spaces, schools, and other community facilities. And that's where all the servicing exists. So by directing more growth into those existing settlement areas, it means that the municipality doesn't need to dig up more roads and pipe and extend services. It helps to grow more efficiently. We also look at secondary plan policies. And what a secondary plan is almost a mini official plan. So the official plan covers the entire municipality, and a secondary plan provides more detailed policies for the development or redevelopment of a smaller, more specific area. And so Kilworth has a secondary plan that provides policies specifically for that community. And the official plan includes policies for preparing and other secondary plans, which we feel can probably be enhanced or expanded to provide a little bit more direction so that the municipality can apply new secondary plans to other communities that are experiencing significant growth. And the third thing on the slide is taking a closer look at language that maybe inadvertently discourages infill development. So when I look at an official plan, I look at those guiding principles that usually talk about encouraging new development or redevelopment within existing areas, but sometimes there's policies that have the effect of discouraging that new development, put up roadblocks in a way and prevent people from redeveloping their properties. So we recommended some policy changes related to that. Next slide, please. And so we have another poll. Heather, I wonder if you can bring that one up. And the question now is, do you support continuing to direct growth towards the serviced urban areas, such as Ilderton and Kilworth? And your options are essentially prioritizing them. So yes, Kilworth, yes, Ilderton, yes, all urban areas within Middlesex Center, no, or unsure. So we'll just give you a few seconds to answer that. So it looks like yes, and that's good to hear. You know, it goes back to one of those early comments that we heard from residents, which is a lot of support for the agricultural area and maintaining that agricultural and rural character outside of the settlement areas. And so helping to direct the majority of growth into the existing urban areas really helps to support that. I suppose we can close that. I don't know if there's another one. All right, then let's move on. So of course, you're all familiar with your municipality and where you live, but for the sake of discussion, we've sort of placed this map here so that if we need to reference back later on, then we can do so. But the key thing here is we've identified those urban settlement areas, being Delaware, Komoka Kilworth, Ilderton, and Arva. And beyond that, this map also shows the hamlets, which are sort of secondary locations for major growth. And we'll probably end up talking a little bit more about what all of that really means. So let's go to the next slide. One of our considerations in reviewing the official plan was a new version of the provincial policy statement, which provides very high-level policy direction for the entire province. And the official plan is required to be consistent with that provincial policy statement. One of the major changes in the last year to that document is a policy that states that municipalities may make adjustments to existing settlement areas outside of a municipal comprehensive review, such as what we're doing right now. So previously, you could only adjust settlement area boundaries during an official plan review, such as this. And now there is policy that would permit those changes essentially at any time, provided that they meet certain criteria established by the province. And what we felt was important, and I think was echoed or supported by the stakeholder committee and the technical advisory committee, was adding policies into the official plan that clarify the municipality's position on when that would be permitted or supported. And one thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that the policy allows for adjustments, doesn't allow for overall expansions outside of a comprehensive review, but essentially it allows the municipality to grow in one area as long as it shrinks back in another area. I mean, it can be very complex to determine whether or not that's appropriate. And so we're recommending policies to address that and try to clarify it as much as possible. Next slide. On the subject of infrastructure, of course, like a lot of municipalities in Ontario, there is that situation where your major roads may be county roads and the lower capacity roads might be locally maintained. And so recognizing that in the official plan and where responsibilities are divided between the municipality and the county is very important because of how development applications get reviewed and assessed. So we look into that and try to provide policies that ensure development takes place on locations that have capacity, not just for roads, but also for sewer, water, stormwater. And so what that means for the official plan is updating the servicing hierarchy for consistency with the provincial policy statement and for the county official plan. So if you're able to review the directions and recommendations report, we talk about the stormwater management policies. There's recent work completed on stormwater master plan, as well as the implementation of the county cycling strategy, because there's a huge opportunity for collaboration between the county and municipality in making cycling a safe and convenient option for people, both for recreation, but also for getting around the municipality. We're recommending updates to transportation system policies and hierarchy. And a really big part of the infrastructure discussion is the land use discussion. So we talk about providing development policies that will lead to development that may support transit, public transit services in the future. as well as policies that can encourage alternative energy systems so that the municipality and individuals may be more self-sufficient. Let's go to the next slide. So we're on to another poll. Heather? So this question is, as the transportation network expands, should we invest in initiatives like cycling, sidewalk expansion, and bus connectivity? And your options are yes, no, or unsure. Just want to get a sense of the temperature of the room here. And that's a 66% majority in favor of investing in cycling, sidewalks, and bus connectivity. So that's very good to hear. It's good to understand that and get that perspective. Thank you. The next subject area where we provided some recommendations is related to natural heritage and hazards. You can also think of this as the environmental protection policies. So we've reviewed the official plan and recommended updates for consistency with provincial and county policy once again. But the key part here is identifying features through mapping and making sure that the municipal official plan mapping is up to date with provincial mapping and with the Conservation Authority mapping, because they essentially hold the data that's required to produce those maps, as well as updating the floodplain boundaries and flood-prone areas. That's an extremely important part of this official plan update, because it ensures that new development isn't permitted in areas that are going to be under threat of flooding, which could lead to significant property damage or even risk to residents' health and life. So that's a very important part. And with all of these natural heritage and hazard policies, in addition to identifying the features and the risks or the hazards, we're also looking at the process of approving or reviewing development applications to ensure that people understand upfront what features exist on their property and what may or may not be permitted to be added as a land use or a land division application or anything like that. I think one key point that I do want to make very clear, though, is that with any of the changes in the official plan, including this, existing uses are generally permitted to continue. So one of the things that we hear in different municipalities around Ontario is a lot of concern about new mapping over agricultural areas, for instance. But regardless of what that initial high-level official plan mapping says, if you are already farming that property, you're permitted to continue to farm that property. So it's never an intent of these official plan updates to needlessly restrict people's existing land uses. The key is to be forward-looking and to ensure that new developments, new land uses or activities don't have a negative impact on natural heritage or don't result in risks to human health and safety. Next slide, please. So another major topic for this official plan review is economic diversification. There's an understanding that agriculture is a significant and important piece of the local economy in Middlesex Centre, but there's also a desire to bring in different sectors of employment within this settlement area to encourage a vibrant local economy. And you know what, I just want to pre-apologize if my signal starts to break up. I got a little notification that my my connection might not be great, so I apologize. Another key part of encouraging economic growth is supporting a transportation network that's connected between the communities and major centers. And we, once again, the land use is a big part of it. So supporting entrepreneurs, local businesses, and farm-based businesses is extremely important, and promoting tourism that's appropriate for the community. So one of the things that we talk about is on-farm diversified uses, and I think that might be the next slide. Great. Or first a poll. Let's do a poll. So on the topic of home-based businesses, as businesses continue to grow, would you support more variety, such as home occupations or businesses in rural areas? And that's a yes, no, or unsure. It looks like an overwhelming yes. 82% responded with a yes. I am curious to know the thinking behind the no and unsure. So please feel free to send us an email if you want to clarify, because it's sort of those diverging opinions where sometimes we see an opportunity to get innovative with the policy. So I appreciate all of your input. Thank you very much. So we're moving into the general policy topic or umbrella in this section. So like I said, all of these topics really fit together. Talking about transportation or infrastructure, as well as economic diversity, growth management, and these general policy topics like complete communities. So what that means is supporting a mix of land uses within proximity to each other. So rather than having a huge area that's only houses and then another huge area that's only commercial uses, we're talking about allowing certain commercial uses or small-scale commercial uses in amongst residential areas so that you can go for a nice walk and pick up some milk on the way home or something like that after dinner. So we're talking small neighborhood, commercial, mixed-use development, and a range of housing technologies. Essentially, making sure that people at all stages of life are able to make Middlesex Centre their home. So that means when you're moving out for the first time, when you're just starting a family, if you are entering retirement and can't continue to maintain the house where you've lived for the last 30 years, we want to make sure that the policies allow for the kind of development that will provide the home that you need at any stage in your life. And getting that mix right as well. So part of the growth management work is figuring out what the community is going to need in the future and providing policies that will facilitate that development. And that includes updating the benchmarks for housing affordability. On the next slide, please. So let's go to another poll, Heather. Regarding density, do you support medium and or higher density development where appropriate to accommodate some of the population growth in urban areas? And that's a yes, no, or unsure. So that's a yes. 65% answered yes, 24% answered no, and 12% answered unsure. And once again, if you feel like having a more detailed response to that, please send an email to the project email address, and we'd like to hear from you. Thank you. And we have a second question regarding density, type of housing. Which of the following medium and/or higher density housing types would you support? Select all that apply. So your options are granny flats, also known as secondary dwelling units or additional dwelling units, essentially basement apartments or coach house apartments. The other option is duplexes and triplexes, townhouse units, stacked townhouse units, which are essentially a more dense version of townhouses, mid-rise residential buildings, so that would be up to 5 or 6 stories, or I do not support any of these options. Thank you very much. So what we're seeing is fairly even support for granny flats, duplexes and triplexes, and townhouse units, with somewhat reduced support for stacked townhouse units, mid-rise residential, and just a few folks who would not support any of those options. So that gives us a really good sense of supports. So I really appreciate that. Thanks. So the next sort of major subtopic within the general policy section is related to agriculture-related uses and on-farm diversified uses. And this is a fairly recent concept in planning, but it's not really a new concept in general. So an agriculture-related use is essentially the kind of services or retail that supports agricultural uses. So you can think of mills or farm equipment repair. Oh, what else? There's a whole variety. Sorry, but the existing official plan sort of talks generally about rural commercial uses, but the provincial policies speak more about those more specific agriculture-related uses. And essentially, these are permitted within prime agricultural areas, but they aren't farms. And so there's an opportunity to provide more detailed policies that elaborate on what uses are appropriate in farm areas in order to support agriculture and make agriculture a more viable business or economic activity in the community. The second sort of farm-related use that we're talking about are on-farm diversified uses. And what that really means is essentially anything that any sort of additional economic activity or business that you might run from a farm that isn't directly related to growing crops. But could be. Really, the provincial guidelines on this are fairly open-ended as far as what the specific uses can be, but they're very specific about the criteria for permitting them on farms. But examples are, a winery or a brewery, a cafe or restaurant, food processing. So if you have an apiary on your property, actually processing and packaging honey for sale would be considered an on-farm diversified use, or producing beeswax candles or other products related to that. Think about bakeries or preserves and that kind of thing as well. And once again, what we're looking at with this official plan is not just replicating the policies from the province, but elaborating to state what specifically the municipality would like to see in the farm areas, and then criteria for evaluating other uses that hadn't already been considered. The key thing, the last point here is that the key thing is that these on-farm remain secondary to the existing farm operation that's there. Because we don't want those to expand and then all of a sudden not farming anymore. We want to support. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We have another poll question. Should the municipality allow for more agri-based tourism, such as farm gate vendors? How do you feel about that? Yes, no, or unsure? That's an overwhelming support. 89% responded yes. And I think, there's an opportunity, I think, to clarify what agritourism means in the official plan so that residents and farm operators have the same understanding, which will hopefully result in maybe less conflict or less confusion about what is or is not permitted on farms. Thank you very much. So our recommendations related to this are to add a new section to the official plan related to on-farm diversified uses to cover off the things that I was just talking about, as well as agritourism, and directly addressing that to avoid land use conflicts and the conversion of farm properties to non-agricultural uses. Next slide. Another policy area that I know has been of interest has been related to surplus farm resident severances. It's a mouthful. And what this is when a farm is maybe purchased by another farm, meaning that the home, the residence on that farm, is no longer necessary for the operation. So there's a provincial policy that allows for that home to be severed from the property as long as it meets certain criteria. Part of that is that it be habitable and, sorry, what's the other? Habitable and something else. Sorry, but there's an opportunity here to clarify some of these policies because the current policies are a little bit old and they don't necessarily match what the provincial policy states. So what we're looking at are clarifying what's known as a home farm and a farm operation, defining consolidation to clarify that it doesn't necessarily mean that two farms are joining together in order to make this surplus home, but they could be two separate farm properties. And the establishment of minimum lot size or criteria for determining the appropriate lot size for the parcels involved. And that all goes back to the policy statement, which has more general policies about what that's supposed to be. We're also looking at requirements for certain information. Like I said, making sure, once again, this is all about ensuring that farmland remains farmland, viable agricultural uses. And if you end up splitting a lot of properties on this basis, sort of on false pretenses, then you can start to break up that farmland and it starts to cause issues for new farm operations or minimum distance separation formula. Farmers might be aware of that and how new residential uses can limit the size of your operations. So we want to make sure that that's all taken care of and protected in the official plan. Next slide. But overall and in general, policy should discourage new lot creation in the agricultural area, except under certain conditions. And once again, there's general direction from the provincial policy statement on this and an opportunity to be more specific and relevant to the community here. So severances related to minor boundary adjustments can always be considered. Agriculture-related commercial and industrial uses may be, severances for those uses may be permitted, even though they aren't farm uses, but that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Severances for conservation purposes can be considered, for instance, to protect floodlands or significant natural heritage features, and of course, resident surplus to a farming operation. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Matt. So we will now enter the Q&A portion of tonight. So again, you can submit any questions or comments you have for the team using the chat function. And I believe we already have one question, which is great. If you would prefer to ask your question vocally, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and have you ask your question that way. But just to reiterate Michael's earlier comment, tonight we're really want to discuss the high-level policy recommendations for the updated official plan. So, the intent of tonight's meeting isn't to get into any site-specific issues, but really focusing on the great policy recommendations that Matt has just presented. So the first question that we have are, how are population projections for each community determined? If certain communities are constrained due to lack of public infrastructure to support new growth, how is that factored into the growth projections?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. The process for this has been to begin with the population forecast provided by the county. So the county identified population that the municipality is expected to reach within the next 25 years or so. And then to, like you mentioned, determine how much of that population is likely to go to each of the communities. That determination is based on past growth rates, so seeing where people have historically gone, as well as apportioning population based on the supply of existing designated lands that are available. It gets very complex, and I'm not the economist who did this. Our colleagues at Watson Associates provided these, did this background work on growth management. But essentially, it's looked at first without considering the public infrastructure exactly. The communities that have public sewer and water were prioritized for population allocation. But any constraints that are there come in the sort of the second stage of the assessment. So if the math suggests that a certain community is going to accept more population than what the services can support, then we have to have a bigger conversation with the municipality about whether those services are to be expanded or remain the same, in which case there's a need to reallocate that population to one of the other communities. So it is a complex process to arrive at these numbers. And I would encourage you to look at the growth management discussion paper that's posted on the website. And if you still have more questions about that, please send us an email and we can take a little bit more time and try to provide a more detailed response for you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I have a few questions through the Q&A as well as the chat, so we'll get through to both of them. First one in the Q&A is, what does redlined OP mean?
Well, that's a really good question. So one of our next stage is going to be the preparation of a red line official plan. Is we take the recommendations from our report and that we would recommend to include, and we write it right into the document of the existing official plan so that you can see what we're proposing to delete and what we're proposing to add. And it's all done in red text, and that's why we call it a red line. That will be presented as a draft, sort of as our first recommendation to council, and provided to the public as well, so that you can read it. It's easier than reading these individual recommendations, like in our directions and recommendations report.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Next comment we have is, could you please provide any information on granny suites in agricultural areas? So
I mentioned this earlier in the presentation. So granny suite is also considered a secondary dwelling unit or an additional dwelling unit or a basement apartment or a coach house apartment, something like that. It goes by a lot of different names. Currently under the official plan, these are not permitted in agricultural areas. But it's been a few years and there is some demand for that. And really, if we can apply certain criteria or design considerations for that, we're recommending that granny suites be permitted within the agricultural areas, as well as anywhere that residential uses are permitted. The Planning Act was amended fairly recently in the last few years to require municipalities and semi-detached homes and townhouses, as well as in accessory buildings. And that sounds like a lot, but really what it means is as long as it can be serviced, as long as you have space to meet parking requirements, and a number of other circumstances. So that is the recommendation that we're putting forward. Once that policy is written and presented to council, there can be further discussion.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. How do we expect post-pandemic influences will affect the official plan?
Of course, that's on the top of everybody's minds these days. It came up during our stakeholder advisory committee meetings as well, and I believe members of council have raised that in meetings as well. Of course, the pandemic is temporary. Well, hopefully, it will end very soon, and until then, of course, it has changed how we live our lives and how we work and shop and go to school and everything else. But once we move through this, even though we won't be back exactly the same, a lot of things have changed. Land use and the things that make up a strong community are not likely to change. Having employment options close to home, having retail and shopping and services available close to home is always going to be desirable and is always going to support the local economy. There is obviously, a need for improved internet connectivity in all of our communities. And in rural communities in particular. So the official plan does make recommendations for improving those complete communities, like we talked about, as well as we're recommending policies that will support the expansion of high-speed internet infrastructure, and I think that's going to be the main thing. Also, one piece that we didn't talk about earlier, but is going to be a big part of sort of that general policy question, is the provision of quality open spaces and recreational outdoor spaces. So we're recommending policies that will ensure that there's sufficient parkland and outdoor recreational facilities or amenities available for people. So once again, that's been something that's proved to be extremely valuable during this pandemic when everybody's sort of staying home, having that option of going out for a walk or a run or what have you.
Definitely, thank you. So we have a question kind of about our approach. So when WSP is evaluating the public opinion for these recommendations, what strategies are used to mitigate the confirmation bias in favor of the opinions and goals of, say, council leadership or prominent people and businesses within the community?
That's a very good question and very thoughtful question. So our process in updating the official plan begins with the Planning Act. Now, I'm trying to structure this response as I go, but because, I mean, I've been doing planning for more than 10 years now, and just about every time I go to a new position, we end up having this discussion about like, how do we communicate planning? What's our process and everything else? It's a constant thing in the planning industry. So we begin with the Planning Act. The Planning Act says that the official plan has to cover off, vision for the community and where residential growth is going to be accommodated and a few other things. It also requires that official plan to be consistent with the provincial policy statement, which, like I said, has these broad policies that give direction for. Then we get to the county official plan, which provides more specific policies, but still fairly general throughout the county. And then we've got the local vision. So all the input that we receive, we have to consider whether that fits into those other levels of policy. And if it doesn't, then we look at it and we try to determine what is it that this person wants as an outcome. So you might have, we did the poll regarding different housing types or different densities, and you could see that there was some support for higher densities, but there was also those who didn't support it. And often when somebody puts forward a position that doesn't go along with desire and outcome, maybe they're not articulating as well as they could. So we try to find out exactly what the desired outcome is, and if there's a way to achieve that outcome while meeting the policies, then we want to do that. And that's why we do all this public consultation, so we can get all this feedback and understand what people are hoping as an outcome. And we do that with council as well. And ultimately, we put together a package of policies that we feel represent the community vision for the future of the municipality while meeting those higher level county and provincial policies. And we present that to council, and council, being your elected representatives, make a decision that they feel represents the local position as well as meeting those policies. So there's a few different layers and there's a few different opportunities for interpretation. And that's our general approach and the way that we try to avoid sort of that confirmation bias or, a bubble or an echo chamber. So I hope that helps explain that.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'll move over to the chat because we have a few earlier questions there. So how has the plan review addressed changes resulting from Bill 229, which is changes to the Conservation Authority responsibilities?
Well, it doesn't have, it is a really good question because that was a major update to legislation in the last year or so. But it is a separate legislation from what the official plan has to deal with. So Bill 229 affected Conservation Authority responsibilities and what they can influence. But the official plan is still directing development away from the same natural features and the same hazardous areas. So it doesn't have a major influence on the official plan. It may influence how the Conservation Authority operates later on and where they provide their permits, but they're sort of, they don't exactly overlap. So it doesn't have a huge effect on the policies of the official plan.
Great, thank you. Question about whether the Watson report is shared on the website. I believe this has already been posted to the project website in addition to the discussion
so the initial
papers.
the initial discussion paper is on the website, but once Watson's more detailed growth management report is complete with the land use allocation or the land needs assessment and population allocations, that will be shared online. Yes.
Great, thank you. Is there any planning happening at the moment to grow the geographical size of the establishment of Delaware?
I mean, this is this review is looking at population forecasts and whether or not the existing settlement areas are sufficient to accommodate that development. If it's found that more land is necessary, then we go through sort of a second stage of review where we determine which settlement area is likely to take on, or most appropriate to take on the largest share of population, as well as, like I mentioned, there's another level of review where we look at whether the servicing exists and can be expanded or appropriate for that additional level of population. So Delaware, as well as Komoka-Kilworth, as well as Arva and Ilderton, those boundaries, and whether it's even necessary to expand them or which direction they should be expanded. And I think I am going to turn off my video just to try to cut down on the amount of data that has to fit its way into my apartment.
That's good, thanks. I guess kind of piggybacking on the previous question, will we be supporting growth in other small hamlets?
So I think one of the distinctions that needs to be made is between growth and development. So the smaller hamlets that don't have municipal servicing, so don't have municipal sewer or water, are still encouraged to develop, and their population may grow. But as far as sort of growing those outer boundaries, that's not something that we're going to be recommending, simply because that population is more appropriately directed into those serviced municipal areas. But that being said, we're still talking a lot about economic diversification and helping communities have the services that they need within, a short drive or within walking distance. So we are looking at policies that would support new development within those smaller communities, within the smaller hamlets, although it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a new subdivision that's it, or a mid-rise tower, or a whole new townhouse development or anything like that. So supporting the health and strength of those smaller hamlets, absolutely, and supporting economic development within those hamlets, absolutely, but not exactly supporting substantial growth within those areas.
Right, thank you. Next question is, will the moratorium to sever surplus farm dwellings be lifted anytime soon? Perhaps a question for the municipality.
Michael might be able to speak to the.
Yeah, no problem. The bylaw was enacted in February of this year for that particular matter. As you're aware, the ICBL is in place for 1 year, which enables the municipality to conduct the studies, and it aligns nicely with the official plan review because the policies in relation to surplus farm dwelling severances is part of this review study. And so we're hoping that following the 1 year, we can come out with some policies and guidelines that will assist with any future applications.
Great, thank you. All right, so the next question we have is, the planned growth of the City of London has produced some unfortunate results. You know, a question about whether the assumption of growth is good, and I guess how do we manage that?
I'm not sure if Matt's there, but I think just looking at some of the references that Matt alluded to earlier this evening in terms of looking at secondary plans, because we want to make sure that we do growth in a proper way, and we have strategies in place that can do it in incremental and pragmatic, so that we're taking our time and we're thinking it through and just trying to plot it out properly over the foreseeable future. And that's what this comprehensive review will afford us.
All right, sorry about that, folks.
It's all good. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Michael. All right, sorry, I'm just trying to find the next question. All right, will the OP have language supporting strong urban design guidelines to ensure quality architecture and building materials, such as adding Section 41 language from the Planning Act, which gives municipalities more control over matters of exterior design of buildings to prevent low quality and standards? Good question.
Thank you for that. That's a good question. Our scope does, so for folks who don't have an idea of what that means, urban design guidelines are an additional set of guidelines for how buildings should be designed, and including applying requirements for number of entrances in the front, or how the second story might step back, or number of different criteria or guidelines that would be applied. The scope of this project does not include drafting urban design guidelines, but what we would be recommending is policy that supports the creation of new guidelines or helps direct the municipality to apply guidelines under certain circumstances. We wouldn't necessarily want to have to go through an urban design review for a single individual home that's being built on a vacant lot or maybe on a farm property. So we will be looking at that and trying to apply an approach that makes sense and is appropriate for the community.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go back over to the Q&A app because I see we have 5 questions in the queue, and hopefully we can get through to them all before the end of tonight. First one is, my only concern about home occupations, especially in the settlement areas, would be increased noise or disturbance to the neighbors. For example, I wouldn't want to live next to someone running power equipment or hammering all day or having bright lights on all night. Very reasonable. What are our thoughts?
That's a very excellent point. And there is a distinction made typically in the official plan between a home occupation and a home industry. So a home occupation would be defined as including something like accounting services or maybe even hairdressing, depending on certain conditions. But it wouldn't include small engine repair or carpentry, cabinet making, that kind of thing, unless maybe if it meets certain criteria, like being able to provide a certain level of separation. But we will look at that, and I do understand your concern there. These things can have negative impacts that aren't necessarily intended initially. So thank you very much for that.
Great, thank you. All right, the next one. How can the OPR support solving the climate crisis and farm income crisis simultaneously? So reducing chemical inputs, increasing sustainable farming methods, diversifying production, supporting smaller family run farms, increasing local or regional consumption connections, etc. So great question.
That's a really good question and a huge question. So I appreciate that, and I'm glad to hear residents are thinking that sort of holistically and thinking about all those connections, the way that each of those things connects to the other. And I would say that through this official plan review, we are talking about economic diversification and permitting a range of appropriate uses on farms. So we touch on that. In terms of environmental protection, the official plan can't regulate something like pesticides or how a farm operates in terms of ecological impacts. So that's left to maybe other regulators. But we can, like I said, provide sort of those additional income opportunities. So maybe they're able to operate in a way that might cost more, but is healthier for the environment, healthier for the earth. And then the other aspect of addressing climate change goes to what we were talking about with complete communities. So ensuring that you don't have to drive an hour and a half in order to get certain services or products and or employment, trying to facilitate the development of local businesses, local entrepreneurship, and local jobs helps reduce those commuting costs, commuting impacts, and hopefully has a positive impact on climate change.
Great, thanks again. So our next question is a segue from the Bill 229 question. Can ministerial zoning orders override the official plan?
The very short answer is yes. So for those who aren't aware, the Planning Act provides the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing with the authority to pass a zoning order, which can authorize development or land use on a given property or a given geographic area, regardless of what the local planning policies state. And it's essentially a zoning bylaw written by the provincial minister. It's something that is historically been used very rarely, but in the last 2 years has been used much more frequently, essentially because the province has a mandate to provide more housing, facilitate new development and employment, and in some cases, the local planning process moves more slowly than they would like, and so they've taken the measures to approve minister zoning orders in order to facilitate that development. My understanding is their approach is to only impose these zoning orders when they have the support of the local council, recognizing that hasn't always been the case. But it's true, they can pass a zoning order that goes against the direction in the local official plan or a zoning bylaw. And it's not a new power. It is something that has existed for many years. It's just being used a little bit more frequently now than it was before.
Great, thank you, Matt. Now, next question is, will hamlets that are currently not on full services be forced onto full services within the next 5 to 10 years?
The short answer on that one is no. Michael can jump in if he likes, but the official plan, as I mentioned, is really looking at directing new growth, new development towards areas that already have existing municipal services. Michael, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Right now, it's, as Matt, I think he referenced it earlier, where if there are certain hamlet areas that can accommodate certain growth within the area boundaries, then the municipality is reviewing any applications that do come forward. But at this point, and as you were able to do one of the poll questions earlier this evening, we are looking at diversity of growth, but more geared towards our settlement areas where their infrastructure is more prominent, and to grow those other larger areas before we look at any hamlet growth.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. You mentioned secondary plans for specific centers earlier. Once the official plan review is complete, will there be public engagement on the secondary plans, or does this happen in parallel to the official plan review process?
That's an excellent question. So secondary plan is technically an official plan amendment. And what that means is certain requirements under the Planning Act kick in, including new public meeting, new public open house, and notice to the public regarding the secondary plan project or process beginning. So this official plan project is one process, and we'll be recommending prepare a secondary plan and when to require that. But then those actual secondary plans will be a separate process. It's possible that the municipality may choose to begin one of those processes at the same time, but it will have its own separate public engagement process, and so it's not going to be exactly piggybacking or embedded within this official plan review. And I should clarify, I'm not aware of any intent to begin a secondary plan process at this time, but the idea is to set things up so that they can be undertaken at a later date.
Yeah, Matt's just right. I think the last part was just it. We're hoping that the findings and all of the reports that arise from this official plan review will lead us in the direction where we want to provide for future growth. We do it in the right way, and utilizing a secondary plan is another option in our bag, a bag of artillery that we can use just to make it happen. But nothing planned in the immediate future.
Thanks, Michael.
Great, thank you. A question we received was, why did we not mention any small or lower density forms of housing in the list of dwelling options? This was in reference to the poll question earlier.
Oh, so this sounds like a reference to tiny houses or micro houses, that kind of thing. And maybe you can clarify if that's not the case. But essentially, a tiny house, which is something that's sort of come up in discussion about providing lower cost housing options more recently, is it's just sort of a house. So in terms of land use policies, we talk about permitted uses, and those would include single detached home, semi-detached home, townhouses. You're all familiar with that. An individual small house would be considered a single detached house if it's located on its own lot. A variation on that would be a garden suite, which is a small home that might be located in the backyard of an existing home. And the Planning Act has certain requirements for those. And we would be including discussion of that in the official plan. Essentially, a garden suite is a temporary, removable small home located on the same lot as a primary dwelling. And it provides low cost, short-term, short-term in the great big scheme of things, housing for a period of up to 20 years. So they can be permitted through a temporary zoning bylaw for a period of up to 20 years. I don't think the official plan currently talks about garden suites in that context of tiny homes, and tiny homes aren't mentioned, but it's something that we can include as an example of what a garden suite is. And I think the only other aspect of that is that the zoning bylaw might have provisions for minimum dwelling size or minimum gross floor area. That would be a separate project. So the update of the zoning bylaw would follow the completion of this official plan update. And there might be an opportunity or desire to include provisions to permit smaller homes in that case.
Great, thanks, Matt. We received a couple follow-up questions regarding MZOs. So one, can they be appealed by citizens? And can they override the provincial policy statement?
So minister's zoning orders cannot be appealed by citizens. There was a recent case in Pickering where the minister's zoning order was challenged, was subject to a court challenge because it had the effect of permitting development within a provincially significant wetland, which is protected by the provincial policy statement. And the accusation there was that, or the legal interpretation of those who were challenging the minister's zoning order was that the minister's zoning order does not have the authority to override the provincial policy statement. Ultimately, I believe that zoning order has been withdrawn, and I don't know exactly the status of that court challenge, but that would be the opportunity to really prove that interpretation, prove or disprove that interpretation of the Planning Act. It does appear that minister's zoning order is not capable, does not have the authority to override the provincial policy statement. But it's still kind of an open question.
Okay, great, thank you for that. Next question is maybe one for Michael. It's asking how much coordination exists in this process for collaboration on shared priorities with adjacent and regional municipalities?
Sure, yeah, I'll take that, Natasha.
Thanks.
As we alluded to earlier in the presentation, part of this intake process also includes engagement with various stakeholder groups, and operating in a two-tier environment. We want to make sure that we're collaborating with our counterparts, and planning is done at the county, as you're aware, and we have individuals included as part of our advisory committees that are also helping with input and analysis when it comes to these policies that we're discussing this evening. So one of the goals is obviously to make sure that we complement and assist with the planning process when we're trying to think of it at a larger level, to make sure that we can be as less bureaucratic and try and move things forward. And the way to do that is through collaboration and making sure that the policies we enact in Middlesex Centre is complementary to that of the county. And so it's essential that we have that dialogue, and we are having that as part of this review. And so we're very fortunate that we can work together and make sure that any policies we review is done in tandem with the county.
Great, thank you for that, Michael. Now we're currently at 7:27, but we have a few questions left.
I just wanted to jump back in on the MZO discussion. So Amy helpfully provided a link to a piece of legislation that I had forgotten about. Bill 257 included a provision that that would make it unnecessary for a minister's zoning order to be consistent with the provincial policy statement. So that's just an update that things have been changing so quickly lately in the planning world, so I apologize for that. But yeah, it's a concern. Unfortunately, there isn't much that the official plan can do to influence how the minister chooses to use zoning orders. But it is a tool that's available to the province.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Amy, for that. So again, just being mindful of time, maybe we follow up with one last questions before wrapping it up. But I also wanted to make sure to remind everyone that, any comments or questions that we received tonight that we were unable to answer, they will be taken and compiled by the team and addressed during our comment and response matrix, which will be made available during phase 4. And we also track and respond to any comments and questions that we receive outside of tonight's public open house that way as well. So again, any comments or questions that you send us, they will be reviewed and responded to. So last question. Matt, do you think that garden suites would be permitted in addition to granny flats, so on farm properties, for instance?
So I believe the intent of the Planning Act is that they be considered essentially separately. So the other aspect of it is that authorized through a temporary zoning bylaw, whereas the granny flats are permanent alterations to a dwelling or an accessory structure. So if the zoning permits that, so the official plan and the zoning permits the granny flat, that's a permanent structure, permanent alteration. The temporary use bylaw authorizing a garden suite is on top of any existing permissions on the property. So conceivably, a garden suite could be permitted, but it is subject to a site-specific approval by council. So there may be circumstances why it wouldn't be appropriate, and there may be circumstances where the granny flat would not be appropriate. So it's not a blanket approval for all of these types of dwellings on all properties.
Great. Thanks again, everyone, for your really thoughtful comments and questions, and Matt and Michael for being available to answer all these questions. This has been a great Q&A session. And so just to wrap up tonight's meeting, I'll go through the next steps. So as I mentioned, we've had engagement meetings last week with stakeholders as well as tonight's public open house. So all of this information will be compiled and summarized, and an engagement summary report will be prepared for phase 3 of this project. And the summary of, the consultation that we've been holding and the feedback that we've received will also help inform the final directions and recommendations report, which will be prepared and finalized this summer. And once both of these reports are available, they will be posted on the project website. And so once we wrap this up, we will then move into phase 4 of the project, where we will begin to draft the official plan amendment. And as part of this process, we're going to be consulting with the public and stakeholders again. So there will be a public open house and a public meeting held during this time. And again, that feedback and consultation will help inform the final updated official plan, which will eventually be presented to council for their consideration. And so a way to stay informed during the project, as we've mentioned earlier, there is a project website which you can access by going on the municipalities website. So if you just search official plan review, then the project website will come up. This is a great resource to learn more about the project, learn about the project updates, any key milestones or upcoming engagement events, as well as access project documents. So the draft directions and recommendations report is already up there, as well as the 5 discussion papers that we touched on as well. And if you come across any questions or comments that you want to share with the team after reviewing these documents or after thinking about tonight's presentation more, we really encourage you to reach out and contact us via email. The email address is there. It's planning@middlesexcenter.on.ca. And again, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I will now hand it over to Michael for some concluding remarks.
Great. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Matt. I've got the pleasure of Mayor DeVete, who's with us this evening, and I'm going to hand it over to her actually for some concluding remarks on this evening's event. So Mayor DeVete, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Let me just start by saying, when Michael told me about the number of people who had registered to participate and so the sheer volume of registration, I was really pleased is really an understatement, but I was very, very happy to hear that news, because for me, it speaks to the interest that residents have in taking part in an official plan that shapes their community. And it speaks to their willingness to give time and thought to how we're growing and how we're going to be in the next 5, 10, and 50 years. So I was also, as I listened to the presentations and every question and comment that was made, I think it's also evident that the quality of the questions and the comments indicates that people really are giving this serious thought and are thinking. I think the word integrative comes to mind again, the questions that talk about economic variables and so geographic variables and how they all interact. So the terminology and the process, everything that people are interested in speaks to me that this is important, it's being taken seriously, and people are willing to give it time. So I want to thank all of the residents who did take part tonight for their thoughtful input and comments and questions. I think all of this is key to our having the best possible outcome we can get from this document, and it'll guide our work and it'll be so the linchpin that we can keep us going in the right way going forward. So I encourage you all to continue to be involved as you have been. As Natasha pointed out, there's information about what's been done. You can get up to speed on it. If you're missing something or you want to review it, go ahead and do that. And then continue to watch those social media channels and all of the information that comes up from the office about the future meetings. And hopefully we can do them in real time, face to face, and not worry about our internet connections. So I'll look forward to those. And I also want to say thanks to Natasha and Matt for all the work that you've been doing. It's really interesting to see it unfold. And again, thanks to our staff, all of the people that have been working hard at the office. And I'm really looking forward to next time. It's exciting and it's good work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mayor DeVete. And again, to echo the mayor's comments, thank you everyone for attending this evening. We look forward to hearing from what you have to say. So the information is there. Please check our website and get in touch with us. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully in person for our next one. Thank you and stay safe.
Great, thanks
Good night.
everyone.